Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to tonight's virtual ocean talk from Rot to Ritz with two of Australia's leading wooden boat building champions. My name is Emily Jadif, and I'm the curator of ocean science and technology here at the museum. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Gadigal people, who are the traditional custodians of the Bamul and Badu on which we live and work. As a National Maritime Museum, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of all Australian waters and lands. We pay our respects to them, their cultures, and their elders past, present, and emerging. We'd like to warmly welcome you to tonight's virtual webinar. We're disappointed that the Classic and Wooden Boat Festival couldn't proceed as planned, but thanks to our sponsors, Classic Boat Supplies, we're able to deliver them to you online. This is the first in a series of 3 consecutive talks delivered on the 3 Thursdays in May. Tonight, Rot to Ritz is our first. There are a lot of things that you have to consider when undertaking a heritage vessel project, whether to revise, to restore, to rebuild, or many more things. Tonight, we are in discussion with Ian Smith and the museum's curator of Historic Vessels, David Payne. They will share with us stories and insights into both of their long careers and some particular historic vessel projects. I'd like to start by welcoming David. Hello, David.
Hello, Emily. Thank you.
David is the museum's curator of historical vessels. David has been involved with many vessel restoration projects for the museum and private clients since the 1980s. He also manages the Australian Register of Historic Vessels and has developed vessel management plans for the Maritime Museum and other regional museums throughout the MAPS Heritage Grant system. This helps guide the interpretation, restoration, and display of heritage craft nationwide. David, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
I have a few questions for you.
Good.
Excellent. First, we're going to talk about a project that's near and dear to the heart of the Maritime Museum, and that's the Krait. Can you tell us about your experience with restoring the Krait and what was different about this particular project?
Well, I've got a lot of experience with restorations. I've been lucky. I actually was employed by the museum as a consultant, working with my uncle, who was a naval architect, Alan Payne. In the early days, we established a lot of plans, did a lot of documentation for the craft that the museum was collecting at that point. And a number of these actually needed significant work done on them. And so the plans had to reproduce that. It had to actually invent or create what was going to be done. I subsequently got some private work doing that with various things, including boats in New Zealand. I've done a couple of the Logan boats over there. But you'll see on the screen at the moment the plan for two particular projects that I felt have always been blueprints for how to go about doing this work. You really need to document the boat as much as you can before you start physically doing the work. The drawing on the screen at the moment is the taipan. That's an 18-foot skiff that's actually out in the foyer behind us. That was Ben Lexon's boat, and that was when he was Bob Miller. And that boat shows all sorts of features and the way he did things and his characteristics that all came up again when he actually designed the America's Cup winning boat, Australia 2. But this boat from the late 1950s, early 1960s encapsulated that story. But to get it right, we actually had to rebuild the boat exactly as he'd done it, including numerous mistakes that he'd made at the time because he was rushing it. That was a really classic project to be involved in. Another project that has been dear to my heart for the museum is making Akarana sail again. Akarana was built in 1888 and then restored in 1988 in New Zealand. But they didn't have all the information at the time. They did a very good job, but when the boat came back to Sydney, it didn't sail terribly well. My uncle and I actually gave them some advice at the time on what we knew was wrong in terms of the physical numbers. It didn't have the stability. But it came to me in 1997 to actually redraw all the plans for the keel and reproportion the rig so that it was correct. Those were two sort of projects where everything followed quite a normal path of let's go through the drawings, all the information we have. But with Krait, the information was somewhat limited, And it became a sort of means of, I guess the word I used all the time when I spoke about this, we have to come up with a credible result without having an actual photograph of what the item was that we were going to put in there. So Krait was different. We had the boat, we had a lot of structural work that needed to be done, but we also had to create a lot of things where we only had a couple of words sometimes that described what was there. There were fuel tanks, for example, and some capacities and not a lot more. So it was different. The other thing that was different too was with the title here, we're talking about Rot to Ritz, and certainly Akarana and Taipan needed to look pretty ritzy at the end because they were beautiful boats and they were nicely finished. But with Krait, it's a workboat. It was a fishing boat and it had to look like a fishing boat when it did its commando raid. So we had to recreate that look too without it looking too drab as though it wasn't being cared for.
So you had to restore it to a particular moment in time, which is fantastic.
We were lucky. We actually had a day in time we thought we could aim at on its trip when everything was set up and it was halfway to through the Indonesian waters.
That's fantastic to have the opportunity to restore it to one pinpoint moment. So how did you begin? Where did you start on such a monumental project?
As I've done with all the projects, you start with what you know. I was working with another fellow at the time who sadly passed away. Warwick Thompson was our fleet surveyor for many years, but he stayed on a volunteer basis to work on this project because he'd spent a lot of time with Krait and it was a boat that he was a favourite of his. We sat down on the boat working out roughly where we thought those bulkheads would go. And then I thought, well, I've just got to have an accurate plan of where everything is that we know is on the boat, and then from there work out where we're going to put the things that we know are supposed to go on there and how they're actually going to fit. The other thing I did was produce a drawing of this is actually what it's going to look like. You need to know now before we start what I'm going to do to this boat. It is not going to look like what it does at the moment. And I quickly came up with this sketch that was pretty close to what it eventually became. But I needed to show there were quite a few things that were going to be different from what they were looking at, and there was a good reason why. So we sat down, I produced that big drawing. It's 1 to 24 scale, so it takes up a bit of room on the drawing board, and gradually nutted out where the things were going to go, where the radio room would fit in, where lockers would go, where tanks would probably fit in, all at a big scale before we came to the more detailed drawings that happened later on. And you've got a shot there of them actually starting to physically put some of this basic work together. These are the decks going back on and so on, around which the next stage happens where we actually do the fit out and so on. But they were working from the big drawing, how do we actually put together the basic structure and do all the repairs that were needed, because this boat's still in the water and we needed to do a lot of underwater work and so on with commercial shipwrights to do it.
It's always difficult when it's not out of the water, isn't it?
Yes, that's
Adds
correct.
an extra level.
Yeah.
So this was a shared project. So you had the commercial shipwrights managing the repairs in stage 1, and then the museum took over in stage 2. What happened along the way with this combination?
It worked really well. The first thing we did was actually make sure we had a really good tender document that specified things had to be done in a heritage fashion. That brought the right people in to actually quote for it, and out of that we got an excellent quote from Michael Bartley Shipwrights in Woolwich, people that the museum's actually worked with before. And they were prepared to do all this structural work correctly, which is almost archaeological. When you take something off, you want to be careful what you're taking off. Absolutely has to come off. And then look underneath as to what's there. Does it expose something new? Does it show us how the boat was built? And this is what we learnt along the way, particularly up the stem, where we were taking some of the initial planking off. We showed some intriguing joints that the Japanese fishermen building the boat had done. That was really interesting to learn that sort of work. And also Warwick Thompson was able to oversee it, which was really important. It allowed me to keep work on things in the museum while he checked how the actual physical progress was going with the rebuilding of the hull and the rebuilding of the deck and so on. And one of the key things they did was get the shear line looking right again. It had a nice curve to it in those days, and I thought that's something we have to get back. But then it was time for us to take over, and that's where Fleet moved into top gear. Damien, who manages Fleet, Damien Allen, and the senior shipwright there, Cody Cody Horgan really got involved and joined in, and we brought the volunteers in as well. You're looking at pictures now of some of the details we had to do, and this is the radio communications room, which was actually fish hold number 3. There was only a very simple sketch in a book that was actually drawn probably a couple of years after the raid had taken place of what the radio room would have looked like. And this was typical with what we had. A couple of simple sketches. The diagram that's showing up at the moment is just the fuel tank capacities. That's all I knew about them and roughly where they would have been laid out. We had to actually invent a series of fuel tanks to go into the holds. We had to work out the fact that the only way they got in there was through the hatch that was above them, so they couldn't be any bigger than that. It was just like designing a real boat. You've got to fit the fuel tanks in through the openings that are there at the time, or they've got to get out that way to be able to be fixed. So we created these simple drawings for a number of things.
Simple drawings.
They're very simple sketches, because then I passed it on to people and said, well, how would we create a credible result? And this is what happened here, for example, with those fuel tanks. We set them up in the boat, secured them in place, and then said to one of the shipwrights and a couple of the volunteers, you sit here and figure out how you would plumb that in a way that you had one central place where you sat with a pump to then individually pump the fuel from each tank in a proper sequence up to the gravity tank on deck. So they sat there and they came up with a system that came up with the result, and it looks correct. The only thing they had that was an advantage over the original people doing it, when they were rebuilding Krait to go on the raid, they probably had about 2 weeks or less to do it, whereas we had a couple of months. So rather than saying you've got to have this done by Friday, I said, you've got a couple of weeks, but sit down there and come up with an answer, and I'll come down and see what I think you've come up with. I don't want to over-specify this at all. I want to try and recreate the ambience of how this would have actually happened, because that way we'll probably get a result that'll look about right, rather than being over-engineered.
I like that, room for creativity.
Yep, they loved it. It gave them a chance to do things and really feel part of it. And that's the way it was with just about every aspect of the rebuilding of the boat.
And how do you judge the end result? I know that's kind of a loaded question. I think it's great.
Yeah.
It's right out there. If you'd like to see it, you can't come to the museum right now, unfortunately. But you could, if you're walking over the footbridge, you can look down and see it parked next to Ina at the museum's wharf.
But you can judge it first by the fact that we knew this boat had to be crowded. There was one survivor left, and I'd been able to speak to him, and I'd actually been to visit him in Adelaide, but he wasn't able to come to the boat. But he did describe things and said, you know, this is how it worked, this is what we did, this is why this was a particular height perhaps, and so on. So when it actually came to be set up, we could see that, yes, it's working the way he said it would. And it feels cramped. That was one of the things he said. So I've got that part right. Ultimately, you stand back and look at it. Does it look like the fishing boat or the volunteer coastal patrol boat that it was for many years? You stand back and say, no, it actually looks like a Japanese fishing boat. But I can already start to see some of the things that they put on there that we could sort of vaguely see in the photographs. But the best thing is when you actually get other people on board, what do they judge it? And one of the key things was we actually had to have it ready for the 26th of September, 75th anniversary of the raid. And that's where you're seeing people coming from the War Memorial, people from the special services as they exist now, and some of the people that have been served in it for years. They came on board and they looked around and they thought, wow, this boat is telling the story now. That's one of the key things. It didn't tell its story. It just looked like a volunteer coastal patrol boat. But now you can judge it and say, yes, you've got it right, because you can look at all the aspects of it and say, yes, you can see how they lived in the back of the boat with the galley. You can see how that radio room worked. You can see the explosives in there, even if they're actually only door handles wrapped up.
Thank goodness.
You can see it. So that's how we judged it.
Well, that's wonderful, David. And to see the result of such a great collaborative project that's now on display at the Maritime Museum is just really heartwarming and fulfilling. And I guess if people want to know more about Krait and the project, there is a video on our website right now that was developed by the museum's USA's program. and that is in commemoration of Operation Jaywick, which is the raid that Krait participated in. Thank you so much, David.
Thank you, Emily.
I really appreciate it. That was fascinating to find out more about a vessel that's just outside our door. And now I would like to introduce Ian Smith.
Hello.
Hello, Ian. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
I'm just going to introduce you first. You have a 40-plus year career in boat building and boat building education, and Ian has built upwards of 80-plus boats. Since retiring from commercial work, Ian has concentrated on passing on his skills and experience through books and videos. He is the author of, and I'll list them, The Open Boat, The Origin, Evolution and Construction of the Australian 18-Footer, and Wooden Boat Building, the Sydney Wooden Boat School Manuals, and his new book, The 18-Footer Britannia, 100 Years of a Sydney Harbour Icon. He sails his replica Britannia with a historical replica fleet and is building a Caravel-planked Ranger-class gaff sloop, which sounds like a fantastic project. Thank you for joining us this evening, Ian.
Good to be here, thank you.
Now I'm going to lead in with one that's dear to my heart as we develop a new Sydney Harbour exhibition here at the museum. How did your interest in this particular iconic Sydney Harbour vessel develop?
Well, back in about 1981, as a young boat builder, youngish boat builder, I bought a copy of Bruce Stannard's new book at the time, Blue Water Bushman, which was a compilation of photographs from the Hall collection from the late 19th and early 20th centuries of Sydney's open boats on the harbour. And I just got fascinated by the boats that were in that. And a few years later, in about 1990, Robert Tian and a few skiffies started up the Australian Historical Sailing Skiff Association. And they began to build replicas of their various open boats of Sydney. They started with a 6-footer and they built a number of 10-footers. Now, I was a yacht sailor rather than a skiff sailor at that stage, but I knew a lot of the guys through boat building, and I was invited along to join a 10-footer in a race out of the Drummoyne Sailing Club in about 1993 or so. And we did two laps around Cockatoo Island, and even though we capsized on the second lap, up to that point, it was the most enjoyable sailing I'd done for some time. I said to myself, how long's this been going on? And of course the answer was more than 100 years. And I decided there on the spot that I would build a replica or two myself, and I started. So following Robert's lead, I built a 6-footer, the Balmain Bug, and I built a 10-footer and campaigned that for a while. But I always knew that I'd build an 18-footer at one stage, and it was a pretty obvious choice for me to build Britannia, mainly because it still existed and could be copied exactly, and also because it was a significant vessel in the history of 18-footers in Sydney and of the Sydney Flying Squadron, which was the club that still exists, and we were the club that we were sailing the replicas out of at the time.
You were just building your way up with the smaller craft and getting to it.
And learning to sail them too. I'd never have felt confident to take the tiller of an 18-footer if I hadn't had a few years sailing a 10-footer, because anybody that can handle a 10-footer, which is basically a miniature 18-footer with 4 or 5 people on board, anybody that can sail one of those is a valuable sailor for any class of boat.
That's some good news for a lot of people listening and for us out here today. Yeah. So what information did you have to work with? I mean, this originally it was built in 1913. What did you have left?
Well, because the boat existed and David here and his uncle had drawn up the plans, I had those very plans to work from. Also, because the original boat existed, I was able to do a lot of close-up work to it. It was out of display in 2001 when I started the project. So I was able to crawl up close and take lots of photographs and take individual small measurements that weren't able to go into the drawn plans. And the boat had been really well restored by Rick Wood and Nigel Shannon, but for display, not for sailing. They kept as much of the original fabric as possible. And there was a hell of a lot of research done, of course, by David, and Dana Fletcher, Michael Staples at the museum at the time. And it was just it was an obvious choice to be able to use all of that information to build it. And I even picked up things off the boat itself. Just looking at, Wee Georgie was a master craftsman. Wee Georgie Robinson, the man who built it and sailed it, was a master craftsman. And you only have to look at the boat just outside your window there at the moment to see that he just had a really good eye for proportion. Things like his knees were tapered to just a nice, beautiful curve, and it was exactly the boat that I wanted to build, and it was all the information was there.
I wish people could come see it. Soon you can come visit. That's it, yeah.
Yeah, let's hope so. Yeah.
That's good. Well, what new techniques and materials did you have to learn in the Britannia build?
Well, because I'd been building boats for 20 years or more at that time, I had most of the techniques, and I was familiar with most of the timbers that we'd use. I did also talk to a number of older chaps that were still around at the time that had done it in the day. Guys like George McGugan, who'd restored the Yendes. It's also out there next to Britannia, and he'd also built a few boats back in the late 1940s of that type. I also talked to the late Bill Barnett, Kenny Minto, Ronnie Borkwell, Jimmy O'Rourke. Guys like that had a lot of tips to give me about batten seam construction, which was the way that all of these boats were built. I did have to use a few judgment calls. The boat, as delivered to the museum and as restored, the ribs that did not cross all the way from one side to the other. They had been repaired. I made the call, and Rick and Nigel agreed with me that between the bilge stringers there was an extra layer put on, scarfed across, and we determined that it wouldn't really have been that way when brand new. So I built it with single ribs all the way across as we worked out that we thought it would have happened as new. I documented it as I went along, and the books you mentioned there and the videos, there's a video called Building Britannia, which on YouTube, which has a whole, has the history of building the boat. And I documented it into the open boat so that in another 100 years, if anybody wants to build another replica, all of the information on the techniques is there.
That's wonderful. Thank you for saving that for the archive, the record. I think, yeah, where I've got a minute, I will mention that both Britannia and Krait are listed on the Australian Register of Historic Vessels, so you can go to that site for more information. But I have a very important question for Ian. How well do you think you achieved your aim to replicate the skiff?
I think I achieved the aim very, very well. If Wee Georgie was suddenly able to be plonked down in the hull, he would be a bit puzzled, because it would seem he would recognise it all, but he would just suss that there was something slightly different, I guess. I used all of the original woods in all of the original places and all of the original techniques, the copper nails and so on. Having said that, though, we did have to make some compromises. The rig, especially, we used modern materials, because we used stainless steel wire rather than galvanised rigging wire, but I did hand splice it as was done originally. We used Tyrolean ropes and sails for various reasons, rather than grass ropes and cotton sails, and I think we've lost something by not doing that, but it was a decision we had to make. But it's very important, the hull itself, it's very important to get these things right. If there's no real point in making a replica if it doesn't actually replicate. If you just do a rough interpretation, you've got an interpretation. You don't actually have a replica. Okay. And we are in a fairly unique position. One of my recent videos was about Britannia's centenary, And in that, I interviewed Michael Staples, who's still working in the industry, and he pointed out that the situation we've got with the Britannia replica and the original is relatively unique in the world. We've got the original boat preserved, and we've got a replica that we can sail and sail hard without worrying about losing the original boat. The nearest thing that I can think of would be the Viking Ships Museum in Roskilde in Denmark, where they have built working replicas of a number of the boats that they dug up in the fjord there. We sail the boat hard, and it doesn't really matter if I damage that hull, and we did damage it once. We had an idiot yachtsman T-bone us, but I was able to repair it. But if that had been the original boat, it would have been a disaster for the nation. So it's a good compromise, well, not a compromise, it's a good situation to have the original and the replica, because the artefact itself is only half the story. The other half of the story is how it was used.
Correct.
And we're just lucky to have that, to be in that position.
It's like archaeology and applied archaeology. You know, you have to be able to see how it really operates in the wild, as it were. Were there any materials that were incredibly difficult to source for you? That you really had to go the extra mile to get this particular thing?
Not impossible, no. There was slight difficulty. I had to, with the Australian cedar, it's getting more rare, and I had to order it well in advance. But seeing I did that, it didn't hold me up at all. I did actually, with a bit of publicity for starting the project in the community, I found a number of old guys pulled out little bits of cedar that they'd had large bits of cedar sometimes, that they'd been keeping for 40 or 50 years just for a sensible project. And when they realised they weren't going to get one, and the Britannia project came along, I was donated a bit of timber, and so that was very handy.
That's fantastic. Community input into the project. That's wonderful. Well, we're running a little ahead of time, which is great, because I think that way we can get you two conversing, which is what I'd really like to do. We now have time for this in conversation, so we'll set up for that. And I'd like to ask you both how much you get absorbed in a project of this scope. And be honest. I mean, do you not see your family for 2 years?
You really do get absorbed in some of these boats. You're doing it because of the story of the boat, and you start to get involved in that, and you start to realise, I've got to get that story right by getting the interpretation of the details right. And it was particularly noteworthy with Krait, because that is such an important story, and the background to the people who risked their lives on that commando trip, and subsequently some of them lost their lives on another one. That sort of weighs heavily on you. And I know we all, fleet and the people at Michael Bartley's shipyard, felt it was actually a privilege to be working on this boat and to be going down there each day. A practical way you can measure how much you get absorbed is how many times I walked from my desk to Krait and back each day. And when you look at your phone, you realise you've travelled 5 kilometres and you've only been going backwards and forwards.
Well, that's why you won the museum's walk-off.
Probably, yeah. I was conditioned. But Ian, you must have got absorbed in doing Britannia and realising I'm actually doing something, and this is a huge respect to what we Georgie did.
For sure. It's, I'm in the habit with any project of waking up in the middle of the night and thinking about it and plotting and planning what I'll be doing the next day on it. But I found that any time that I'm doing any of the techniques on a historic vessel, I just find I'm very privileged to be able to do something that's been done for centuries pretty much the same way. Yeah.
And I know this is in your book, but just for my sake and the audience's, how long did the project take you all up?
It took me 1,500 hours over 11 months.
That's not bad.
Sorry, the other way around. It was 1,100 hours over 15 months. And a number of other volunteers helped when we needed 2 men to nail off and to steam bend the ribs in and things like that. Some volunteers contributed another couple of hundred hours. So longer than the original would have taken. It was claimed that the original boat was built in 6 weeks. but there were wee Georgie and his father and his older brother were working on it at the time. And they were all set up in a boat shed to do it. So I believe that was probably the case. 6 weeks doesn't sound unreasonable for something like that if you had several guys and were flat out of it. I was doing it part-time and, in my own time.
And waiting for cedar. Yeah.
Yeah.
So can you tell us about the first time you took it out on the water?
We launched it in October 2002. Faye Magna, the daughter of wee Georgie Robinson, launched it, poured the champagne across the bow. And we went out, and as I said, I was a little bit nervous because I'd only sailed 10-footers before, and there was a good strong southerly blowing, but we reefed down and went out with the fleet. And then the breeze died completely. And so we just sort of drifted around. We even sent Adam South out on the boom because we couldn't unreef while we were out there. He swung out on the boom like a monkey with a knife in his teeth and cut the ropes so we could cut the reef out. So it was a wonderful day, and a number of people from the club took a lot of photographs and things like that, and put a little souvenir book together about the launching day, which was very nice to have.
That's fantastic. So I think this is one for the audience. Tell us your key principles. What are the key principles that you have when undertaking a project like this that you'd like to pass on?
Well, in terms of replica building, I think the overriding principle is to replicate it. Yep. Don't make as few compromises as possible. And as I said, I have compromised on the boat, on the rig. Not on the hull. I used every timber originally. Oh, well, I did slightly on the hull. The bottom stringers I couldn't find. The originals were Cowrie, but I couldn't find any Cowrie suitable for that task. I did have one piece that had been old floorboards, but it was so dry and brittle that when I bent it into position, it just shattered. So I used silver ash. But other than that, every single timber is the same shape, size, species, and in exactly the right place. So that would be my overriding principle.
Yeah. I would, from a museum perspective, I guess we've got a fairly sort of almost rigid protocol we work to and have done for many years. The first thing you do is do nothing on the boat. Look at what you've got and document it and produce what we call a management plan, a vessel management plan or a conservation plan, or what you actually want as the outcome. And that outcome's usually, it's sort of driven by, well, what is the story the boat has to tell and how's that going to be interpreted? So you end up writing a lot of that before you've even done anything. At the same time, that's where I come into my own, being able to prepare the actual plans for the boat, because they work in tandem with that management plan and then any tender documents or other documents that are coming out of it for materials. So it's a research thing, and the more time you spend on that, the more likely it is you'll actually get the outcome that you're intending to do. The trouble is everyone's waiting to actually do the work, and it's to some extent costing money. Costing money sitting there doing nothing. So you've got a little bit of a balance there, and the pressure's on. It certainly was on a little bit with Taipan there, where some of the people not working on the boat but who were supporting us were very keen to see action, whereas Simon Sedubin, the builder, and Bob McLeod, who was also working with him, were happy to just gradually take that boat apart and take the things that weren't meant to be on there off. That revealed a lot of information for us. If we'd rushed it and pulled all that off and just started work, we would not have got the outcome that we got. So it's a documentation thing is what we push. Do your research, then start the work. That's the principle.
That's a good advice
I agree with David there. I did the same thing with Britannia. The museum had already compiled a lot of the research for Rick and Nigel to do the restoration work, and they made that available to me, and I went right through that. But Ronnie Robinson, the son of wee Georgie, was still alive at the time, and I had a couple of good long chats to him about various things, including things like I was trying to make sure that the if the name had been painted on the stern, which was usually the case, that I would get the right lettering to make it look the same as it was originally. but the only photograph that I could find of the stern close up showed no name painted at all. And this was in the 1940s when Ronnie, as a teenager, was sailing on the boat. So I asked him, did he remember, the name being painted on the boat and what kind of lettering it was? And he told me that it never had the name painted on the stern while he was sailing it. And when he'd asked about it, he said that apparently they told him that apparently it was painted on originally, but at some stage in the 1920s or 30s, when they were bringing in the spinnaker poles, which are huge forks of Oregon, pointed at the pointy end, they brought it back into the boat and stove it right through the transom. And when they repaired it, they didn't bother to paint the name back on again. So it was just a simple story, but that was the answer.
It's a good one. I just figured they'd done enough work. And it saved you in the end. You didn't have to find the right font.
No, I just used something that looked, looked original, gold and black, of course, in the Balmain Tigers colours that we Georgie always wore. A gold and black in block lettering with a shadow line, basically, which was the style that you would see in photographs of other boats, basically.
That's fantastic. And when's the last time you went out? I'm sorry if that's a sad question.
Well, the last time we went out was Saturday, 7th of March. The week after that, we decided to cancel, basically, because of the COVID crisis. It was a great day's sailing, and again, we've got a few bits of video of that, and we just have to look at that to cheer ourselves up.
Tide yourselves over. That's it. Well, those are excellent principles. So I'm sure there's lots of stuff to be said in there, like have fun, enjoy yourself, don't, hide in a corner. But those are some excellent key principles for undertaking your own heritage boat replica or restoration project. What we have here now are a couple of questions that were provided to us by audience members prior to this talk. So I'd just like to pull those up now, and then we will ask these of David and Ian. The first one is for Ian. How is Britannia holding together? Do you think your work has matched the strength of the original, which has lasted so long?
I think it has, because it was built in exactly the same way with the same materials. We do sail it hard, and it does have wear and tear. And I've refastened a number of the rows in the bottom of the boat, largely because of the number of big buffy feet that are running over them, 30 races a year. Yep. Several planks have cracked. We've been sailing for 18 hard seasons, so that's the original boat sailed for 23 seasons over 25 years, and then was a motorboat. And I do know that we Georgie repaired it a number of times, but I have repaired a number of the bottom planks just because they were split and letting in more water than we get over the side. So, and there's videos of that too.
That sounds to me like you've got it right. If you're recreating the work that we Georgie had to do on the original yourself, yeah. You've made the right choices and so on. I can remember on Taipan watching that sailing and thinking, have we actually got this right? And looking at a photograph and realise, yes, we've even got the right wrinkles in the sail by accident. We can thank Jack Hamilton for that, perhaps. But yeah, we've reproduced things.
I was thinking this. How long have you two gentlemen known each other?
It must be 30 years. But,
it goes back to the Wooden Boat Association being set up in the late 1980s, I'd say. Yeah. And that book they wanted to publish that we got involved in.
Yes, that's right, yes, yeah. Which is still available through the Wooden Boat Association. Some a valuable contribution to maritime heritage.
Yeah. That's fantastic.
We've worked on a few things since then. You've actually built a numnumber of designs of mine, and so on. Yeah, it's been quite a long association. I commissioned a couple of your designs too.
The 17-foot ski boat, like the old Lewis style that you drew for us, and the snapper boat, like the little fishing boats that used to sail around Sydney Harbour.
Good projects to do, not almost replicas in some ways. Almost replicas.
Yeah, they're generic replicas. Yeah.
Mm.
Sounds like a good marriage. I have another question. It leads in well off that. How do you get involved with restorations? without the cost of owning the boat to be restored. This is a good one.
Volunteer at the Maritime Museum or the Sydney Heritage Fleet. They will. There are guys there who have the experience, and they would welcome new people to come along to, and you would learn from those older guys as you went.
I can certainly pick up on that, because that's would be my first answer. There are institutions, and it's not just the two big ones in Sydney. A number of other maritime museums have got small craft that's happening more, and they're working on those projects. There's a fabulous project just completed down at Huskisson with the Maritime Museum there, where for almost as long as 30 years, it's certainly 25 years, they've been restoring a little motor launch down there. That's one that sort of brought myself and Michael Staples together again, who was mentioned earlier, on a very cold wintry day, measuring it up in the water to produce the plans and the conservation plan. They've been through a few volunteers, but they've had a couple of stalwarts that have kept with it, and they've managed to bring this little motor launch back to life, and it's back on the water. But our museum certainly has a lot of volunteers, and Krait was a project where volunteers were definitely involved. Indeed, I referred to that with that fuel tank thing. When I finally set them down with the tanks set up and said, we've got to work out how to plumb this, there was one tradesman there and two volunteers, including Big John, and said, this is your job now. You're the ones that have to come up with the ideas, because that's how it probably happened. So I'll leave you to it, but this is what it's got to do, and it lets them get involved and really feel part of it. But the volunteers at the museum are involved with all sorts of varnishing projects, other maintenance things, and even using the boats. And there are private organisations too. I can toss that one as well. Some of these big projects really get set up as a non-for-profit organisation on its own. It requires a couple of people with a good business nous to make this actually happen, and even just get the paperwork through. But then once it's set up and they've got donations coming in, the other thing they do need is volunteers to actually do the work. And they'll take people on and train them to do the jobs, or or if they're lucky, they get people who are experienced who just want to keep doing it. And that's where you'll find in most places something going on where you can actually go and help. So you don't have to own the boat, which is a very expensive thing to do. Anne and I know all about that. And you can be part of it and really enjoy the process.
And what about if you wanted to learn how to build boats yourself?
There's not many opportunities as there used to be. I used to run a school, but it nearly sent me broke. It only exists now as an online presence and through books and videos. There are plenty of videos internationally available, like on YouTube, for example, a number of guys that are doing restoration work and doing it very well. There's particularly a guy called Leo Sampson Goulden in the United States. He's an English guy, but he's restoring an Albert Strange yacht called Tally Ho, a very large 60-foot yacht. But he is a guy that learned it. He's in his 30s, I guess, but he's learnt from the right people in England, and he's doing that very thoughtfully and very soundly. And anybody that watched anything he's doing there would be able to learn a lot. He's got a lot of videos. He puts a new one out about every 2 weeks. There's another mob called, they call it Acorn to Arabella. Now, they're less knowledgeable, but they do ask questions of the right people. They've had experts call around to advise them, and they're doing a John Atkins designed yacht from scratch off timber off their own land. And that's an interesting one as well to see. There's a couple of other guys that you would get links from all of those to other guys that are doing such work. So there is plenty of stuff available on YouTube.
Yeah, I think one of the things I can remember from people trying to build their own boats was a lot of people end up actually having a surprising number of skills. They're just perplexed by the fact that this isn't a square box like the table they made or something. It's got curves and so on it. When they can get a little bit around that and realise there's a way of setting this up There's a way you'll work around those problems, and suddenly it comes back to a lot of things that are straight edges and so on. It then becomes easy. The people that find it the easiest are always the cabinet makers and the house builders. They've got all the tools, they know exactly what to pick up, and they don't have to think about that. But the ones that perhaps find it harder to get involved in boat building and build their own boat are ones that have got the dream but don't necessarily have all the skills behind them. So give them something simple to work on and then build up to the next project.
I did find it hard with some cabinet makers and carpenters who found it really difficult to stop thinking in terms of square and level. So they, not all, a lot of the guys adapted terrifically, but some had that difficulty. The people that were the hardest to teach were the fine woodworkers, like violin builders and jewellery box makers, who want to get everything to within 1 thou tolerance, where boat builders don't do things to within 1 thou tolerance.
You're exactly right. We're not launching this into space. It's just got to go around the harbour.
Absolutely, yeah.
And it's amazing what epoxy resin will fix if things don't quite work out. But you don't try and train them to do that. But
yeah,
certainly,
I
I think Ben Lexon had that problem on something with one of the boats he was working on years ago. And he said, they've made this sheave as though it was on a spacecraft. It's only got to go round and do its job on the mast. It doesn't have to be as engineered as this. And that is an interesting little side problem that does come up.
That's fantastic. I want that on a T-shirt. Epoxy can fix it. So I know in your past you've both done some work with the boat building and work for the Dole. I thought that was fascinating and a really worthwhile way of engaging and building boats, and then working also with sailability and using those boats. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I was given the job of looking after a bunch of people on a work for the Dole scheme back around 99, 2000, and they wanted to build a boat for sailability through the Salvation Army that was organising it, and they wanted to build the Olympic boat, the Sonar, but the person who owned the rights to Bruce Kirby's design wouldn't allow us to do it. So I immediately said to David, listen, can you design us a boat with a similar deck layout to the Sonar that the Paralympians could train on, and but it would be a completely different boat. And he designed what we call the Salvo, and we built 2 of them, and there's at least 2 in Brisbane, 2
in total there were 10 of them built.
10, yeah.
4 up in Brisbane, again on work for the Dole schemes, and then 4 in 2 different places in Tasmania. But that was interesting when they realised they couldn't build the Sonar. That's what it was, I remember. Phil Vardy came over to my place in his wheelchair and sat there and said, I've got 23 things I want on this boat. He had it all written out. And I looked at them all and said, I'll give you 22, but though 23 and 22, you can't have one or the other. And I said, leave it with me. So I did. I actually got him what he wanted. And that was a really good project to do. It was so satisfying. I remember those 2 launch days we had down at Mortlake, and taking the disabled guys out and sailing on their boat. Some of them had worked on it and some of them were just waiting for it to happen. They really loved it. Very
and they
satisfying.
still use them actively. We see them out almost any time we go out on the harbour. On a weekend, 1 or 2 of the boats will be out there with disabled folk on them. So it's really satisfying to have been part of that.
They use them a lot in Tasmania too, and we got the ballast ratio right because it blows like hell down there, and they say we can still go out in any weather. Which is what we wanted to do, show them some rough stuff.
That's a good design and build there. Now I apologise, I had forgotten one of the questions, so I'm just going to circle back to that. Don't want to miss this. What do you do when new information comes to light during the restoration process that might change what you are doing or have done so far?
Right, yes,
That's a toughie again.
I've run into that problem. We knew we were going to run into that problem probably with Taipan, because as we started to take the boat apart, it was going to reveal things that we thought we could see on the photographs, and I was drawing on the plan, but we weren't sure until it actually came apart where some of these bits were, what was going on there. We were lucky that because we were doing the project in a gradual fashion, we could almost stop and not get too far ahead of ourselves. But the classic one was the main bulkhead. That was cut and set and ready to go in, and then they took out the bits and pieces where an existing one was and set the new one up, and then looked at it, and Simon got on the phone straight away to me and said, "David, we've set the bulkhead in place, but you can see all the marks where the old bulkhead was." And when Bob built that boat, he put it 1.5 inches out wrong on one side and probably 1 inch on the other side. In other words, it was skewed across the boat. "What do you think we should do?" I said, "Well, you can see the shadow marks, can't you?" He said, "Yep, absolutely." I said, "Well," and he said, "I'm prepared to take this out. It's only tacked in place." I said, "Yeah, let's take it out and reshape it and put it in the way it was, because we all know it was wrong and we know we can get it right. So let's put it in incorrectly and reproduce exactly what happened at the time." So that was a classic case of sort of getting a little bit ahead of us. A bigger problem, though, was in fact Akarana, and I referred to that being rebuilt in 1988 by New Zealand. They had to have that boat ready on a particular date for 2 Prime Ministers to turn up and launch it in New Zealand. And that was non-negotiable, and they're looking at this wreck and how many months between that, and they just had to get started. They had what research done that they could, and the museum helped them with more, but they basically had to work through and have a finished boat. When it came back to Australia and they started sailing it, a sailing master at the time was actually someone who sailed single-handed around the world in various things, and he was having huge trouble managing this boat and said, "There's something seriously wrong here." And at that point, the museum knew pretty much for sure that the correct amount of ballast underneath was about twice what was there. And that's pretty significant. And that meant the boat really was quite unstable and quite dangerous. So that was a project where they actually had to come back and do a second restoration, because it was serious and we understood what the problems were. And that's where I was very lucky to be involved and invited in. "David, could you come and work out what is the correct keel that's supposed to go under here, and basically review what else has been done?" And as well as finding that we could correct the keel and we could actually do it correctly to what Robert Logan probably did from other research that I then did, I actually found that when I looked at photographs and things, there's some mistakes here in the rig in the proportions. We can get that right too, and there's fortunately a simple way to do this. It's not going to cost too much. So we got everything right, took the boat out sailing, and it was perfect. But that's where subsequent information comes along and you feel you have to get it right because the boat is actually incorrect. Have you run into any of those issues?
I've been racking my brain, but I can't think of anything like that on that question. No.
No, we were lucky on Krait. Nothing really new came up. When I actually spoke to the one survivor and said, "You know, this is what I'm doing here, and this is what we're doing. For example, this is the brown we've chosen." All you could tell me was it was a darker brown than a light brown. And he said, "Well, David, only you and I are actually going to know what the decision was. No one else is really going to know. What you're showing me looks about right, so let's go with that." And unfortunately, no one's come back and said, "No, it's not that brown." And we deliberately did not choose Mission Brown from the 60s because we knew we would get into trouble there. But I suspect it's come up, and I just can't remember the individual things on some of the other projects where we've worked on, where suddenly a photograph has come in from someone else's album that clearly shows something. You realise, well, we're halfway there, but we didn't get it quite right. Sometimes you can just live with that because it's been done, but other times it weighs on your mind and you think, no, we should correct that when we get a chance. So when the time comes, let's get it right.
There's a decision that has to be made, and it has a lot of factors, resourcing and...
You're still working to timetables, not always to Prime Ministers, but you're working to timetables and budgets.
That's a pretty solid one.
Yes.
You've got to get that done. And they did, didn't they?
They did.
Excellent. Good news. Well, that concludes our talk tonight. I'd like to, first of all, thank all of you for attending and for joining this webinar. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Classic Boat Supplies, for continuing to provide Australian wooden boat owners and builders with the supplies that keep their vessels looking beautiful and authentic. I'd like to extend an incredibly warm thank you to our two speakers, David Payne and Ian Smith, for preparing for and delivering such a fascinating talk this evening. I'd also like to thank those working behind the scenes to bring this to you. Now, please do go register and join our next webinar series for the Classic Wooden Boat Festival online. It's Seclusion at Sea with Wendy Tuck, Kay Coddy, and Adrian Callahan. It should be absolutely fantastic, these three major titans of sailing. That will be next Thursday, the 21st of May at 7:30 p.m. Thank you and good night.